Hi, my name is Bob Grinier, and I'm a volunteer with the Martin Fleischmann Memorial Project. And I'm here again with my friend Russ George. We haven't met each other for a long time, but where did we meet?
Here in Brno, of the Czech Republic.
A long time it was in Brno, wasn't it? But I met you in a hotel lobby, didn't I, in downtown Miami today. What were you doing there?
Oh, I was at the Hereticon, Peter Thiel's Hereticon conference.
Yes.
I'm one of Peter Thiel's heretics, and he's the multi-billionaire who funded Facebook and PayPal and a few things like that, who happens to believe that heretics often have the very most important ideas in the world, but then they get declared heretics, and that stops their ideas from coming to the forefront.
So I almost didn't recognize him. I was just going to the toilet because I wasn't invited to that hotel. But as I walked past, I thought, there's someone I recognize, but he looks slimmer than when I saw him last, right? So
I wish I was even slimmer, but that's okay. Working on it.
So you've been a heretic, classed as a heretic multiple times. For which two things are you most famous for?
Well, I'm famous for cold fusion, my heresy in cold fusion, and Sono-fusion, which I collectively describe as atom ecology, because I'm a classically trained plant ecologist. So I always think of things in the terms of like ecological systems. And then my main work is in ocean ecology. So I do ocean restoration, where I've done the largest ocean restoration projects on the planet.
And how did you become a heretic in that industry?
I was hired by the Canadian energy industry in 1999 because I had formed a tree planting company in Canada 20 years before that. And the, Shell Oil and Petro-Canada, all the big energy majors, they said, well, we've signed the Kyoto Treaty and we have to reduce our carbon footprint. And you're the top ecological forest restoration expert in Canada, so please design us a forest restoration project that will capture enough carbon to reduce our carbon footprint. And when I did, I spent more than $1 million of their work as a consultant, of their money as a consultant, doing a proper business plan, and I had to sit in front of my group of directors who were all vice president level guys in the oil industry, and I said, well, sorry guys, I can't find enough empty land in Canada to plant enough trees to make a dent in your carbon footprint from the oil and gas industry. To which they went, oh, that's terrible news. And I said, but the good news is we can restore the ocean. And in a heartbeat, we can remove your entire industrial carbon footprint.
So how did you do that? And because you had some agreement with some
well,
locals?
that was 1999,
right.
and in 2000, I had to make this calamitous, report to the industry that I couldn't, even though I was a tree planting expert, I couldn't find room to plant enough trees to make a dent. But I said, but this red iron ore dirt that is everywhere in the world is what the ocean plant life is dying for want of, because there's not enough dust blowing in the wind. And if we can replenish the dust that's blowing in the wind, the plankton will grow. Plankton being a plant. I originally said, think of it as a ocean forest, right? So instead of growing forest on land, why don't we grow a forest in the ocean? Because 72% of the world is ocean. Of the 28% of the world that's not ocean, only half of it is not ice and rock. So there's only 14% of the planet that grows anything. And that includes all the desert areas, and only a fraction of that growable area on the planet can grow a plant, and only a fraction of that can grow a tree. So 72% of the planet can grow an ocean tree or plankton. Right? So they liked that idea, and they said, okay, Vice Guy, you can add ocean restoration to your mandate. And then shortly thereafter, the Canadian government decided to renege on its ratification and commitment to the Kyoto Protocol that it had signed. And so they wrote a letter to the industry in Canada and said, we are not going to require the fossil fuel industry to go to any expense to reduce its carbon footprint. And And since a bunch of the Canadian industry, like Petro-Canada, was a crown corporation, they're not allowed to work on projects that aren't required. Right? They have to protect the shareholders' rights, which in that case is the crown, and the shareholders won't allow you to spend money on something that's not required. So when the Canadian government reneged on its promise to reduce its carbon footprint, our project plug was pulled. So
you found a way around that, didn't you?
well, I did. I mean, in 2002, I was living on a sailboat in San Francisco, and I was walking down the dock one day in the fog, and in front of me there was this shadowy figure walking down the dock ahead of me, and he had a heavy coat, big coat on and hat, and he was smoking some kind of strange tobacco.
Yeah.
And I caught up with him on the dock, and I said to him, as I caught up and we were walking the same thing, I said, "Hey, don't bogart that joint, man. Pass it over to me," which was a good rock and roll slogan. And little did I know, as the joint passed over to me, it was passed over by Neil Young, and so it was the perfect rock and roll introduction. So Neil and I walked down the dock, smoking his very good quality ganja.
Interesting. Oh, okay.
And then and we got to my boat, which was the second to the last on the dock, and his turned out to be the last, which was a 150-year-old Baltic schooner sailboat. And my boat was a 50-foot sailboat covered with 6-foot tall test tubes full of seawater that had been made, various shades of red, muddy seawater with this material. And I was doing the science to prove that this adding iron, red dirt to the ocean could restore the plankton blooms of the ocean. And Neil said, "Wow, what a great idea." So we spent the evening together on his boat, and the next morning there was a knock on the side of my boat, and the captain of Neil's yacht came over and said, "Hey, Neil, I really loved your story about restoring the ocean, and since your boat's too small to do the work, but you told Neil that his boat was big enough," he says, "me and the boat are yours for the next 2 months."
Hey!
So all you have to do, you have to, and since you said you could do this work between San Francisco and Hawaii, Neil has a fabulous house on the seashore of the Big Island of Hawaii. So in 2 months' time, we have to drop this boat off at Neil's house on the Big Island of Hawaii. But between now and then, it's your science platform. And I said, "Oh, well, I'm not sure I know how to do this, put it all together." And he says, "Oh, it's all expenses paid." Neil says, "Whatever you need, hire anybody you want, buy any instrument you need, whatever cost, no matter, just get it on the boat." And it's 22 days sailing time to Hawaii. So I had a little bit more than a month to get, and so that worked. So I did the first experiment, halfway between San Francisco and Hawaii in 2002,
And how did you track the efficacy of the...
Oh, well, we were just looking, this was the very first experiment, so it wasn't a big scale, experiment. It was just to make sure we could handle the materials and get it in the water, and we could study it with some instruments and satellites and things, but it wasn't important that.
So what was your big event where you had what we'd call success?
So then the result of that was that the journal Nature, who has a editor, who was a German editor, happened to be a fan of Neil Young fan. So when he discovered that I'd done this experiment at Neil Young's help with Neil Young, off Neil Young's boat, he decided that the journal Nature should write a feature story on restoring the ocean by replenishing the iron. So January 2003, I appeared on the first edition of that year's journal Nature. And there's no better way in the world of science to have your work acknowledged than to be featured in the journal Nature. So my ocean science career was launched, and but it's a struggle because it's controversial. So it took me lots of twists and turns. But 12
so you have a story about the fish up in Alaska?
Yeah. So 10 years after that, I finally got out to sea on a proper research
This
ship.
would be around 2012.
2012, and we took 100 tons of this material, and spread it over 50,000 square kilometers of ocean in the Gulf of Alaska, making use of the currents and eddies to help distribute it. And overnight, the ocean turned from blue to green. And overnight, when the ocean turned from blue to green, seabirds, which we would see 2 or 3 per day in little clumps in the ocean far out to sea, 300 miles out from shore, suddenly, in the morning, the seabirds would darken the sky. So we were 10 scores of thousands of seabirds that had flown in from hundreds, if not thousands of miles away to feed in this abundant plankton bloom. And whales, we had counted 1 whale every other day before the bloom was stimulated, was restored. When the bloom was blooming, we had so many whales that at no point in time we couldn't count the whales that were visible from the boat. There were too many to count. Right? So all of ocean life was restored. And since we targeted a species of salmon that has a 2-year life cycle.
Okay. So since you targeted a particular species of salmon...
Yeah, so we targeted pink salmon. So we knew that I had made a guesstimate as to what was the most important nursery pasture for the pink salmon that were hatched in the late winter of 2012. And by the summer, they had to be out at sea feeding, and they would come back to spawn the following year. So we targeted this nursery pasture, which we turned from blue to green. And the following year, the prediction was in Alaska, which catches the majority of pink salmon in the Pacific, was that they'd catch 50 million pink salmon in the state of Alaska. But instead of catching 50 million fish the next year, they caught 225 million.
Wow.
And they only stopped catching fish at 225 because there was no longer any capacity on shore to receive another salmon. We believe that an extra 500 million fish came back as a result of our work, which produced the largest catch of salmon in all of history in Alaska. And
so what happened after that?
Well, then and we had been in partnership with Native people in Alaska and the National Research Council of Alaska and Native people of Canada and the Natural Resource Council of Canada and the Canadian Fisheries Service and Ocean Sciences and Canadian Space Agency and Government of British Columbia and Canada had issued us a sovereign guarantee on the project. So we had the fullest backing of the Canadian government at every level. Once the project worked and we had collected 160,000 data samples and we were in the process of measuring and doing the scientific work, the government of Canada decided on Easter, a few days before Easter in 2013, that if we reduced all of that scientific data to reportable scientific fact, we'd prove that there was an inexpensive way to save the world from climate change and to produce carbon credits. So they sent in an 11-man SWAT team into the laboratory in Vancouver, which armed in full ballistic body armor and helmets with automatic weapons. And they threw us all to the floor and held us at gunpoint on the floor while they, executed their 128-page search warrant, which they did by opening up all the computers and with vice grip pliers, pull all the chips off the motherboards of the computers, extracted the hard drives, not with screwdrivers, but with pliers. So they physically destroyed the ability to process and unplug the freezers that were keeping samples preserved that we were working, tipped over the microscopes that were, through the microscopes from the lab benches.
Did you ever get to the bottom of who was doing this then?
It was the federal government of Canada.
But why? Why?
Well, nobody can imagine why, except that people have said, well, they must have believed you did something because nobody would do that if you hadn't done something, right? And what we had done is...
And so that's what made you a heretic in the field of ecological management.
Well, people said, because the World Wildlife Fund once accused us of saying, well, if you restore the ocean and billions of tons of carbon dioxide are turned from poison into ocean life, and you are allowed to sell the carbon credits for that, the oil industry will buy your carbon credits. And that will preserve the life of the fossil fuels, because now fossil fuels, instead of emitting...
So they came into your laboratory, they wrecked everything, basically.
Well, they basically prevented us from reducing the data to reportable proof.
Right.
That something maybe as much as 100 million tons of carbon dioxide had been captured from the atmosphere and sunk in the ocean, repurposed into the ocean for the long term, which would produce a carbon credit.
So you weren't so much as a heretic, but you were a threat to those that didn't want to see the hydrocarbon industry continue, because there would be a solution to the carbon dioxide that is producing.
Yeah, exactly. And so they decided they would object to this by accusing us of being here. So the New York Times had a front page story, called me a rogue American oligarch, right?
Okay.
Who was working with the Canadian industries to deliver carbon credit papal indulgences to relieve the oil industry, the fossil fuel industry, of the sin of emission. Right.
So we don't, I found this in cold fusion. We found a solution potentially to the radioactive tritiated water in Fukushima, and they changed the rules because they didn't actually want a solution, because everyone would have to implement it.
Yeah.
They're either going to keep the concentrated tritium or dump it at sea. So they literally changed the rules of the request for proposal.
Yeah. So our little project with me, with 11 Indian colleagues from a village of 850 people, with $72,000 of this iron ore rock dust, removed 10% of the carbon dioxide emissions from all of Canada in a summer project.
So a bigger project would effectively potentially remove a vast amount of the emissions in the year and solve a lot of the problem that is claimed to be the climate change problem.
Yeah, I was invited by the UN to give a presentation in Madrid in December 2019 at the Climate Change Conference, the big international conference in Madrid. And they said, will you please give a report on how many village projects of that scale it will take to save the world from climate change? And I said, okay, I hate to be put on the spot for this, but you want to do the simple math, 100 tiny Indian villages around the world can take on 80% of the burden of the industrial
So that basically removes the climate change industrial complex, right?
Exactly. So that doesn't make you the friend of the 70,000 delegates at the climate change conference.
Oh my God, yes.
Who are on salary if you're saying, well, 100 villages times 12 people.
You could have just...
That's 1,200 people remove the jobs, can do the job of what 70,000 salaries here at this conference are saying. They'll come up with how to do it.
Probably for less than the conference. So bring us up to the today. You said that in August there's a really good announcement from the European Union. Yeah?
Right. Yeah. So this has been made controversial for years, and it's been a struggle. But on August 14th of this year, 2024, glory be, the European Union gods in Brussels have implemented the European Nature Restoration Law, which requires by law that the European Union restore its trees and its seas using nature-based methods. So not funding research, not funding engineering projects, growing trees and growing plankton in the ocean. And they have a budget of 8.3 billion euros per year, every year through 2025 to get on with the work. So today, ocean restoration is no longer heresy in Europe. It is actually the law. Right?
So now you have this annual fund that enables, they are required, as I understand it, to spend that fund in...
So now it's by law the oceans of Europe must be restored using nature-based methods. So my life to this point has been, as a heretic, been accused of breaking, ecological principles, selling carbon credits to industries so they can continue to pollute, right? Whereas we actually allow them to turn their pollution into food. And so now it's against the law to not do ocean restoration.
Okay, so there's a real opportunity
Right.
here because the actual investment is relatively small. You said 100 villages, but let's just do part of that problem. It's a small investment, and then you would suggest that maybe the carbon credits that could come out of that were far in excess of the small investment, and therefore there's actually a business there, isn't there?
Yeah,
Where you can actually self-sustain after a while. So maybe if angel investors or capital investors now would come in, you would argue, am I right in saying, that it then has a forward momentum that is self-sustaining?
Yeah, I mean, each of our ocean pasture restoration projects that last for 3 to 6 months for the pasture to grow will produce, several $100 million worth of carbon credits.
And how much would the initial
projects-
investment?
But the initial investments are, we need to do 3 projects, 3 years of projects. So in our experiences, we've spent about $6 to $7 million for a single project. So $20 million will produce maybe $500 million worth of revenue.
Well, that
improve
is a
the
real
project.
business, right? So.
Right. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you very much,
All right.
Russ, for having the time and sparing
Okay.
the time to speak to us.
Right.
And I look forward to seeing you delivering this technology for the benefit of humanity and the planet.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Keep trying to do it.